have to have a lot of very awkward conversations very quickly with people. I'm like, let's talk about your sex life.
Nice to meet you. Hi.
Exactly.
Hello. So today we are chatting about surrogacy. I brought in an expert because I don't know anything about it. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Jennifer White, and I am the director of Bright Futures Families, which people know as many different names. So they may know it as Colorado Surrogacy, Montana Surrogacy, New England Surrogacy, Southwest Surrogacy, Texas Surrogacy, or Pacific Cascade Surrogacy. Just depending on where we are, we have a different name because we only operate in places where we have somebody local who can be supportive to our surrogates is what it really comes down to.
Amazing. So yeah, cool. All right. So you run an agency, to help intended parents match with a surrogate, so somebody who is going to carry their child for them. So this is
a lot of trust.
Yeah. A lot of trust on a lot of different parties. Kind of walk us through, let's say I want to be a surrogate. How does that process go?
Yeah, so, and I can only speak to how it goes for our agency, of course. So that means that every agency does things a little differently. Some do screening early in the process, some do screening later in the process. We do ours early. Part of what I feel like our responsibility is to protect everybody's emotional health through the process. And honestly, as an intended parent, once you meet a gestational carrier, you become very attached. And so as much screening as we can do beforehand to make sure that they are a good candidate, we're going to do. So I think for a lot of gestational carriers, especially if you're on like the Facebook groups or those big groups, they're like, I applied to the agency and a week later I was matched. And in our process, it's like I applied to the agency and 3 or 4 months later, I'm still doing the screening process. Wow. They're all about the same length of time. It's just a matter of which direction and which order you do the pieces.
Got it.
Because there are some things that just take time. So from our perspective, gestational carriers can go in and they fill out a really quick intake form and online, and it's about 15 questions long. It's pretty simple. It takes a few minutes. Somebody calls and just talks through what your answers were. And it's just a really good screener for us to know whether or not you're qualified, because it asks some of the very basic questions. So how old are you? Where do you live? So do you live in a state where surrogacy is possible and it is legal? What is your height and weight? And we hate to be intrusive about that, but BMI, unfortunately, is important for surrogacy. So we need to make sure that you fit within those criteria. Big one is, have you had children already? It is a misperception that I hear a lot of people, they say, well, I haven't had children, I don't want to have children, but I do want to give back to somebody. And that's beautiful, like huge heart. Unfortunately, there are so many people that come to surrogacy because they have infertility or they had major complications with their pregnancy. It basically needs to be shown that you can carry a pregnancy without those complications, is why we're asking those questions. Additionally, how many pregnancies have you had? So ASRM guidelines, which is the big organization that we look to for all of our criteria, say that no more than 5 pregnancies. Once you've had that 5th pregnancy, you can be pregnant as a surrogate for your 6th pregnancy, but that's it. So we're really asking to find out, what number you have there. Of course, if there have been any complications in your pregnancies, then you're not a good candidate. So if you had preeclampsia or gestational diabetes or, any number of big flags in your health history, then we want to know, because you likely are not a good candidate. Some other things that we're looking at are things like, are you currently on any mental health related medication? And this is, again, not a mental health shaming thing. I think that if you need to take medications for mental health purposes, 100% you should do so, and you should do so loud and proud. You got it.
Amen.
Right. But you can't take them while you're a surrogate. And so that's one of those things that we're looking for there. That doesn't mean that you can't have taken them in your past history. So let's say you took them when you were 22 years old and you were just finishing up college and you had a major breakup and it made you super anxious and you took them for a year and you're 35 now. That's not a big deal. But if you are currently taking them, then yeah, we need to talk about it. Or if you had to take them due to postpartum depression, or if you took them through a pregnancy, those may be flags that maybe being pregnant as a surrogate is not a great idea for you.
Right.
Another big one is insurance coverage. And I think another common misperception is people like, oh, I have to have insurance coverage to be a surrogate. You don't have to have insurance. We're just very careful about what insurance you do have, because let's say that you have Medicaid, which is government funded insurance. That's a no-go for surrogacy. So in fact, any government aid at all is a no-go for surrogacy. And a couple of these things are changeable, right? So eventually, if your life circumstances change and you're no longer on Medicaid, great, then you'd be a candidate for surrogate then. Or let's say you're working on losing those last couple pounds and your BMI will then be within range, fantastic. And those are things like when we talk to surrogates, we can encourage them through that. And we can say, hey, we'll check in with you in 4 months, or we'll check in with you in whatever amount of time. So that's that first screener. So that's just that very first conversation that we have.
Getting real intimate with people,
I do. That's why I always tell people, I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm about to ask you a lot of really personal questions. So if you need to ask me personal questions, I will answer them too. I get it. It's hard. So once we have a good feel that somebody is likely a good candidate for surrogacy, then we send them our long form application. So it's about 30 pages long, and it goes through all those things, and it's intrusive about all those things, so it talks about your social history, your psychological history, of course, in depth about your medical history. And then we ask a lot of other questions too. Some of them are a little more fluffy. So some of them are things like, we just want to get to know them. What's your favorite color? What was your childhood like? Things like that. And then we want to find out about what they're looking for in a surrogacy journey, and what their expectations are through that process. Once we have that as an agency, we start to verify all of that information. So if she said she had gestational carrier, so she had 3 healthy pregnancies, but she saw 3 different OBs and delivered at 3 different hospitals, then we have to gather 6 sets of medical records, which that is probably the most time consuming part of our process, and the part that a lot of people don't understand how difficult it can be. Sometimes it can be really easy. A doctor's office may turn around and go, yeah, we've got him, here you go, send him back within a week. And sometimes it can be that we make twice weekly phone calls for 3 months and we are chasing those records, and they go, oh, we sent them. Oh yeah, no, we sent them. And it can be a little bit of a chase and be very frustrating. We also, during that time frame, asked the gestational carrier to go back to her OB and have her OB make sure that she has an annual exam done. So make sure they do a PAP and that everything looks good, and have the OB sign a letter saying that it's okay for her to be pregnant again. Because that's ultimately, you want to make sure that the doctor who's going to treat you through that pregnancy feels good about you being pregnant. So once we do that, once we have all those records back, we actually send them out to a practicing reproductive endocrinologist for a professional review. So she looks them over, and I promise that part, once we get there, it takes a little less time. It's usually about a week. So that's a little quicker than the actual gathering of the records. And she gives us a professional opinion as to whether or not somebody is a good candidate for surrogacy or not. When she gives us the thumbs up, then we move into our next phase of screening. So we'll actually interview we used to do it in person. I know we're doing this right now during the time of COVID, and hopefully it's the tail end of the time of COVID. But during COVID, we did adjust to Zoom meetings, but we always wanted to meet in person because there's just something better about getting to see people in person. And we want to make sure that the spouse or partner of the gestational carrier is there as well, because we want to make sure that they have support at home and surrounding them throughout this process. Because, as much as intended parents want to be there and be supportive, I mean, if a gestational carrier wants ice cream in the middle of the night, then it's not going to be the intended parents who are going to drive from wherever they are. It's going to be the partner. And I mean, ice cream jokes aside, it's also more things like when they need to go to the doctor and go to appointments. You want to make sure that they have support at home, and it's not putting a strain on their marriage. There are also some things that gestational carriers need to know, like that they're going to have to abstain from intercourse during the process. And we want to make sure that somebody's had an honest conversation with them about that. And it is not necessarily about being pregnant, because I've heard a lot of people go, well, he had a vasectomy, I won't get pregnant. It's not always about that. Some of it has to do with keeping the uterus quiet. And we want to make sure that everybody understands that this is part of the process and has a real and frank conversation. Yeah, no, it's, I mean, again, we have to have a lot of very awkward conversations very quickly with people. I'm like, let's talk about your sex life.
Nice to meet you. Hi.
Exactly. So we interview the gestational carrier. We then do background checks on the gestational carrier and any adult over the age of 18 in her household. And so that means if she has a sister that's staying with her or parents who have moved in, we do background checks on everybody to make sure that all looks good in her household, as well as a financial background check. We want to make sure that things look good. And especially, I know it's hard to say right now in times of COVID, but sometimes people fall behind. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a perfect scot-free, like absolutely blemish-free, nothing has ever happened in your life. We just want to make sure that there's not a history and that you're not doing surrogacy for financial means. After that, we then send the gestational carrier and her spouse or partner to the psychologist for a psychological evaluation.
I just want to ask one thing. What if they're not married or partnered?
That's why I say spouse or partner, but
what if you're not? Yeah.
If they're single, then we ask a lot of questions about their support network.
Okay.
And we've had things like one gestational carrier, we've had plenty of single gestational carriers. Okay. And in that situation, like she's like, oh, my mom lives down the street. She's super supportive. Have mom come to the interview too, so that mom understands the impacts of how surrogacy could be. So mom won't have to go to the psychological evaluation, but we like to make sure that we get to talk, in that hypothetical to them as well, so that they understand the impact and that we can answer any of those questions, because there's so many misconceptions surrounding surrogacy that we really want to make sure that, that like mom's concern might be that this is the gestational carrier's baby. And then we can explain, no, this really is via IVF. It is the gametes from a female. It is the gametes from a male. They may or may not be donated, but they do not belong to the gestational carrier. Right. So that's why we want to bring everybody in and answer any of those questions as best we can. And it could be that if mom can't go, then we'll do it in a separate session for her so that we can make sure we answer her questions. Okay. So we've gotten her through the psychological evaluation. During all of that, there's a lot of background paperwork, gathering documents. So, if they're employed, we're asking for lost pay stubs so that we can prove what number of lost wages, copies of IDs. A big one for us is to get copies of insurance booklets, because health insurance is huge in surrogacy. The interesting thing is, under the Affordable Care Act law, you can't discriminate as an insurer against a pregnant person and against pregnancy benefits. That doesn't cover when you're acting as a surrogate. So that means that insurers can discriminate and not cover a surrogacy pregnancy. Wow. So we gather all of those health insurance policies and we actually send them out for a professional review to find out whether or not there is coverage. And it turns out only about 30-ish% of the time in our experience that the surrogate's policy will cover. Oh, wow. Yeah, and there are a few that we know. So I'm married to a military member. I can tell you for sure TRICARE absolutely does not cover. So if their spouse happens to be active duty military, we know their insurance won't cover. There's a couple of insurances out there that they say they cover. So, it'll say in there, yeah, we'll cover a surrogate pregnancy, but they'll have what's called a lien on it. And that lien often can be up to the amount of the surrogate's compensation. So that means that, let's say the surrogate's compensation is $40,000. That means the insurance says, yeah, we'll kick in after you've paid $40,000 worth of medical bills, which means it's not really a great policy. So technically it covers, but it doesn't, is what it really comes down to.
So then in that case, do the intended parents have to kick in? with a different
So in
policy?
those situations, that's exactly right. So we start looking at alternatives. And so we'll start looking at the Affordable Care Act when open enrollment opens every year. And so there, in 49 out of 50 states last year, there were policies that covered surrogate pregnancies available to the exchange. And in those cases, the intended parents, it costs them more for their journey, and that's frustrating for them, but at least they have a limit to their medical bill liability if something goes wrong. So that is just getting to being cleared. Once you have to pass all those hurdles just to get cleared, and then we can start talking about matching with gestational period.
So what do you think in terms of percentage wise of people who apply to people who get to now this matching stage?
In our experience, it's about 6%. Yeah, so somewhere it depends on the region, as what I've actually found is that some subregions are a little higher percentage. So anywhere between 6 and 10% is what we see at this point.
Wow.
And a huge percentage of them rule out pretty quickly and pretty early. You know, like I said, that initial questionnaire screener is pretty big for us, is that it pulls out about probably 75% really quickly in the process. And we're not about wasting people's time, you know, so like if we think there's not a good chance, we'll let people know so that they're not spending all of their time chasing something that isn't actually possible.
Yeah.
So that part usually takes us anywhere from 3 to 6 months.
Okay.
So being a gestational carrier is a huge, huge time commitment. And I mean, a common misperception I see from intended parents is like, how do we know that she's actually committed to this process and she's not going to just walk away? And I'm like, well, she's kind of already shown a pretty strong commitment so far.
Right.
She's doing all of this of her own accord with zero compensation and with no knowledge that it's actually going to move forward, is that she spent all of this time putting in all of this paperwork, all of this effort, going to these appointments, and really showing that this is something that she wants to do.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
So when we match, we way back when we talked about applying, gestational carriers applying, we asked a lot of questions in that about what they're looking for in a match. And when intended parents come to us on their side, which is a totally different side of the process, we also ask them questions too. And so every time a gestational carrier clears, we start at the top of our list and start going, okay, is this a good match? And there are 3 items that I feel very strongly about are not negotiable. So whatever both sides say have to 100% match before we can even consider moving down and looking at other criteria. So the first is the number of embryos that a gestational carrier is willing to have transferred to her. And I'm going to stand right on my little soapbox right here and put it out there that I am a really strong advocate of single embryo transfer. I think it is safest for the gestational carrier, and it is safest for the babies that are being carried, the baby that is being carried. That said, sometimes parents have very strong reasons that they want to do double embryo transfer. So we still ask the question because we will honor that request if a gestational carrier is educated and knows what she is potentially getting into. So that is matching criteria 1. The second one is vaccines, which I know people kind of giggle about right now because they think it's a COVID related thing, and it's not. So COVID vaccine is its own little pile. Vaccines in general always was an important conversation to be having, because besides the COVID vaccine, there are 2 vaccines that are requested during pregnancy routinely by OBs. So the first is your flu shot, and the second is the Tdap vaccine. And so I try very hard to have no judgment about what people's opinions are. You know, everybody has deeply held beliefs, but I need to make sure that your deeply held beliefs match with each other. So if you as a gestational carrier say, I would never vaccinate, then okay, but I have to match you with intended parents who absolutely also are okay with you not vaccinating, because ultimately those 2 vaccines can affect their child. Because I mean, the flu vaccine is about not getting the flu while you're pregnant and higher risk. The Tdap actually confers some level of protection to the baby for the first few months until they can be vaccinated. So you really are making a decision if you don't vaccinate that does affect the baby. So The third one, and this is such a difficult conversation to have with everybody because it is so emotional, is your stance on termination of a pregnancy. And it's really hard to be thinking about terminating a pregnancy when what all everybody wants is to have this pregnancy. And it's not because it's likely or common. It's because if you are the very, very small percentage that has to face this decision, we want to make sure that the conversation is easier and that you're all on the same page. So again, there's no judgment surrounding this. Literally what you say on both sides as gestational carrier and intended parents goes. So if you as a gestational carrier say, I would never terminate a pregnancy under any circumstance, that's okay. We just need to match you with intended parents who also would not terminate a pregnancy. The one thing, and I hear, and this is I actually have two things about that. So one, I feel like if a gestational carrier says she would not even terminate a pregnancy in favor of her own life, then she's not a good candidate for surrogacy, in my opinion. And I have had to turn people down for that because I don't want that personal responsibility of having caused something that would harm her life, because she has knock-on effects of her own children and her own spouse that would be affected by that decision. The one thing that I see all the time is that gestational carriers say, well, I don't want to just terminate just because they've changed their mind. And I'd love to address that misconception, because these babies in surrogacy are so loved and so wanted and so desired before you ever get there, that parents don't just change their mind and willy-nilly decide to terminate a pregnancy. Right. So right. I just want to throw that on out there, that, I mean, I that's the one thing I've heard, is that I've had gestational carriers go, well, the only time I wouldn't, they would say I would respect their opinion, their decision if it was a medical decision, but just not if they just changed their mind. And I'm like, they don't. I promise you they don't.
You're spending a lot of money and a lot of
lot of love and a lot of tears. And I mean, I am fully honest that nobody comes and talks to me about surrogacy because it is their first choice or the choice that they wanted to make.
Right.
I'm like, I'm a nice person, but I know you didn't come talk to me because you were like, yay, excited. So beyond those three things, then we start matching based on everybody's preferences. So let's say if the gestational carrier says that she only wants to find intended parents who are in her local state, then obviously I'm only going to look for parents that are there. Same thing with intended parents. If they only want somebody there locally, then we work on that. Other things that we start to finesse as we're looking at matching are going to be how much contact everybody wants to have during the pregnancy. Do they want it to be a very, intimate relationship and really start to develop a friendship, or do they want it to be more business-like? How much contact do they want to have after the pregnancy? Do the intended parents have specific or special requests that they want to make, such as, organic, like more organic foods, or eating organic foods, or avoiding certain foods because they have a religious preference, or things like that? And on the converse side, is the gestational carrier willing to make those, meet those requests? Does the gestational carrier have feelings strongly one way or the other about pumping breast milk afterwards? Some only want to match with somebody who wants that. Some gestational carriers absolutely 100% would not want to pump. I'm like, I can tell you, I would not want to pump. I'm like, I pumped for my daughter because she wouldn't actually breastfeed, and it was miserable, like, and that's why I'm like, so when people are like, I don't want to, I'm like, I feel you, I totally feel you. Right, I'm like, I did it as long as I could manage it, but I did not like it. And I was like, I would not voluntarily do it. So once we think we found a good fit and a good match, we do send the profile of a gestational carrier to the intended parents first. Again, this is a hard process, and so we want to give them that first look.
Yeah.
If they say yes, they think that it looks like a good profile and a good fit, then we send a profile that we've created on those intended parents over to the gestational carrier. And both sides through that profile process get to ask as many questions as they want, find out as much information as they want. When both sides say yes, at that point, we'll actually set up a match meeting. So if possible, pre-COVID, yay. We would try to do them in person. Now they're almost all via Zoom. Even if somebody lives close to each other, we're still in that mode. But somebody from the agency will always be there, because it is the most awkward blind date you are ever going to go on in your life,
I feel like
right?
it's all, yeah, no, awkward, but also I feel like magical too,
Yeah.
in a way,
I,
like.
I love doing match meetings. I think they're fun. I mean, just to get to mediate and be part of that conversation and help people get to know each other, and really, it's fun for me to just kind of watch and learn. And I'm like, I guess I'm a little bit of a voyeur on these things.
I
So
love it.
they're my favorites. So, but also some of those questions can be super awkward, right? I mean, you don't want to ask a stranger, like, hey, let's talk about termination. Yay. It comes from me, and it's a whole lot easier for me to be asking those questions. And sometimes people have questions in the background that they want to have brought up. And then again, they come from me. Nobody knows that either
Yeah.
side brought that up or had that concern. And so then it can be asked and it appears neutral, which is kind of what we're there for. So only after that meeting takes place and both sides say yes is a gestational carrier considered matched. So matching is huge, because if either side says no, we just go back to the drawing board. And I feel really strongly that if there's even a little nagging doubt about it, then you should say no. And because little doubts turn huge over time, especially if there's something else small that goes wrong. And then you're like, well, I should have listened to my instinct about this one thing over here. We want to make sure that this is a long relationship full of trust. I always say being a gestational carrier relationship is a trust relationship governed by a contract, but it's the trust part that really, really matters. And so we want to make sure. So that is bringing in a gestational carrier. That is the process from coming in to matching.
Wow. It's crazy. I mean, it makes sense as to how thorough it is. Like, we're dealing with a human life here, multiple human lives, but like a little baby one too, that it's, yeah, it's crazy how much is involved. And then, from there, there's still so much.
Oh, I say, yeah. Then we
happen.
still have another, over a year worth of stuff going on.
Yeah. From your experience, and I mean, I'm guessing it's different for everyone, from at what point is somebody matched? What is typically the time frame until a transfer were to happen?
And again, because we do all the things that we do on the front end. So from our experience, so I know some agencies match first and then gather medical records and then do the psychological evaluation. So you have to remember that my timeline goes to my perspective.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, generally it takes 4 to 6 months from when you match to when you get to the actual transfer. And the reason for that is, and there's steps, so you always feel like things are moving. They may not move as fast as you want, but they are moving. So usually the clinic that the intended parents have chosen have to review the medical records of the gestational carrier. And that can take anywhere from a few days to 3 weeks, depending on the clinic and how backlogged they are. Then they need to bring the gestational carrier in for an actual medical evaluation. So they're literally going to bring her in and have her do things like pee in a cup, draw blood. They're going to do a sonohystogram or a hysteroscopy, some of those internal ultrasounds to look at her uterus really well. The reason why that can take some amount of time is it's very precise onto when in her cycle it's done. So it's done between days 6 and 12 of her cycle. So let's say you match, you meet, the clinic approves the records, and you're right on day 10 and they don't have any appointments in the next 2 days. Then you have to roll around another month. And so that starts to play into how long that time frame rolls into. Once you've had that appointment, it takes most clinics about 10 business days to give official results. The reason being that they have to send out some results to the FDA, and those literally take 10 business days to come back.
Oh, wow.
And once we have those, then you move into the legal process. And both sides need to have their own attorney who is a specialist in assisted reproductive technology law. And I cannot emphasize enough, needs to have experience in that area of law. I have a lot of people that come in that go, well, I have a friend who's a real estate attorney. And I'm like, that's great. They can sell you a house.
This is not a house.
That's
Temporary
exactly
housing,
right.
But
Right. Or I have a business law buddy. It's not a business contract. I mean, it's just not the same, because ultimately, and I know you know this, and we've had lots of other conversations about this, is your parentage as parents is at stake based around all of these things. And so we want to make sure from the start that everything is right and in the right place. The way we view it is that we should never dictate who any of the parties use as their attorneys, as long as they're within those parameters. So the two requirements I have are the attorneys need to practice in the state where the gestational carrier is going to give birth, because that is the law that is going to dictate, and they need to be a specialist in assisted reproductive technology law. Beyond that, I feel strongly that personal choice is very important in this. So we usually say, well, like, here's a list of all of the attorneys, you have that. You can figure it out. I mean, not you can figure it out, but you can choose any of those attorneys on that list. The legal process usually takes about a month. It's not adversarial. It's just more of a making sure that everybody understands, and there's slight tweaks to the process. I mean, the nice thing about using an agency is that the gestational carriers come in with an expectation of what their benefit package is and how much their compensation is going to be. And the intended parents also have that same expectation of what we recruit gestational carriers at. So you're not negotiating over giant, huge terms. It could be that, as a gestational carrier, you go, hey, it says in the package that childcare is reimbursed at $250 per week. I actually have 4 kids and mine is actually $350 per week. Can we please tweak the number to match the reality of my situation? So it's usually more smaller tweaks like that, and definitely about an understanding to make sure that everybody really understands what they're getting into. So that is absolutely ultimately the most important thing. And that's why those attorneys are so important in that process. Yeah. Once we have that legal agreement signed and in place, then the clinic can actually set the transfer calendar. So and I think that sometimes people in their head, they kind of like, I have this magical, like, so we sign legal, we'll have the transfer tomorrow. It's not that simple.
You gotta get the uterus ready, guys.
You gotta get that uterus ready and get some medication going. And it usually can take anywhere from 30 to 45 days from when legal is signed to having an actual embryo transfer, just depending on where she is in her cycle. And then the medications usually are about 26-ish days of that process. So then the embryo transfer, and the longest 10-day wait of everybody's life.
I know. I never waited. I tested early.
So I will say, if gestational carriers are watching that, if you want or tempted to test, ask your intended parents if they want you to. I mean, there's so many things and so few joys in this process that you want to make sure that you don't take away a joy that they want if they want to hear it from the clinic directly. And also make sure that your protocol at your clinic did not include an HCG trigger.
Yes.
Because that will give you a false positive.
Yeah.
Exactly right. I'm like, it doesn't matter whether your intended parents want you to or not. You're not going to, because it's not going to be a correct result.
Right. I was going to say, I mean, if it's typically with something like that, at least for us, it wasn't, because for me, it wasn't my cycle, because we used Jordana's eggs. So for me, there was no trigger, because I didn't use do a natural cycle. Okay. But yeah, for sure.
Some clinics just do it by protocol that we've just seen, every single one of them do it as an HCG trigger, the week before, about 5 days before the actual transfer. And
maybe for the natural progesterone, or I don't know.
So they started at the same time as the progesterone as well. And I've seen it both ways, and both clinics, I mean, they're equally successful clinics. So yeah, it's just their protocol.
Cool. Well, that's surrogacy in a nutshell, guys.
I know, right? Woo! I say, and then you got to go to the pregnancy and all the other stuff. But yeah, that's just getting to the pregnancy.
Right. I mean, it's crazy. I didn't realize how long it actually took. And it's tough. Like when, when you want a baby, and I say this all the time, you want a baby yesterday. And,
Right.
a lot of times the intended parents coming to you have been trying for years and they're like, okay, I'm ready. Let's
And
go.
that's exactly
So,
right. And it's hard, and that's why we try to do so much in advance that we can. Because I don't want to have intended parents waiting and calling me every day and going, "Hey, did you get those medical records today? Did you get those medical records today? Did you get those like no, no, like those parts I can do in advance. And then I have them in a nice neat little package, and then at least we can start having some progress moving forward. And the same for the gestational carriers. Once they're matched, they're excited too. They really want to, this is what they want. This is the fulfillment of what they've been hoping to do, and they want to get
people are
that process.
superheroes,
I
superheroes. Like
They're
seriously.
such incredible women, who
Oh
are
my
willing to
God.
step up and do this. It's
Whew.
amazing to me, like so giving, so loving, and without fail, every one of them describes their favorite moment of the journey is that moment, that first moment they see the parents hold their child.
Oh,
I
I would lose it. I,
I
I would lose it.
it every time, every
Ah,
one of them, that is their favorite moment of the entire thing, because
I mean,
that is the
the
embodiment
greatest,
of what they wanted.
the greatest gift you could give someone.
Yeah. So
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, thank you for sharing all of
well,
that
of
information and
course.
wisdom. And, for those who are considering becoming a gestational carrier, now you know kind of what to expect and what you're going to go through, and maybe you've been
And why
weeded
it
out
takes so
already.
long. Yeah.
Right. And why it takes so long. I mean, you're bringing life in here. Oh, one other question we didn't cover, but what is kind of the age range that you
Oh
look
yeah.
for in a carrier?
So ASRM, the big medical society, their age range is 21 to 45 is the technical age range. What I find is that intended parents, and this is not me discriminating because I'm definitely over that age group myself, is that intended parents tend to get more nervous after a gestational carrier is 40. So some clinics tend to start de facto cutting gestational carrier rates or ages at about 40. But that said, I think if you're over 40 and you've had a recent birth and you're interested in it, I don't think it should stop you from reaching out to an agency, because I think there are agencies who can help you, and they'll work really hard to do so, because some of it is the uterus is a muscle, and so it really depends how recently it was exercised is probably the nicest way to say that, like, so that if you had a baby pretty recently, then and you're 42, then actually it may be that you're a great candidate. But if you're that same 42-year-old and your last birth was 15 years ago, then that really could make a
Hmm,
difference that goes, maybe not so much. So,
right.
so much of surrogacy is about the totality of the person. So it's
Hmm.
not like you can take one, like, okay, well, I'm qualified because I have had a child and they didn't have complications and I'm the right age and I'm the right BMI. Well, was your last birth 15 years ago? That can really make a difference
Hmm.
in that totality of the circumstance. So everybody is individual, and we try to look at everybody as an individual and take all of those circumstances into account.
Got it. Got it. Awesome. Awesome. So cool. Well, okay. Well, you can find Jennifer. Her website we'll put up here. If you're
So
interested in learning more about, if you're an intended parent or want to become a carrier. And yeah, thank you so much.
thank you for having me.
Of course.